Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Edgar Wright's film, The World's End. This is the third and final film in the Three Flavours Cornetto trilogy, which started with Shaun of the Dead and then moved into Hot Fuzz. And then The World's End is, appropriately enough, the end of the trilogy. So all three of these films are basically Simon Pegg and Nick Frost vehicles. They are the central performers in each of them. Interestingly enough, one thing about The World's End that is different from the first two films is that in the first two films, Nick Frost's character is the slacker, the goof off, the person who's never grown up, never taken any sort of responsibility, etc., etc. Whereas Simon Pegg his character Shaun in the first film, he's not exactly, the most upstanding and successful person, but he has a job. He sort of has a relationship, even though that relationship is in the midst of breaking down. In the second film, in Hot Fuzz, Pegg's character is this amazing police officer who's just miles ahead of everybody else as far as being an excellent police officer. In this film, Nick Frost's character, Andy Knightley, has become reasonably successful. He's a corporate lawyer. He has a nice office. We do find out late in the film that his marriage has broken up, largely because of how sort of dedicated he is to his job. He's also quit drinking, which, considering that much of the premise of the film is about how much as young men they drank to excess and did drugs to excess, is not a bad life choice. He has in many ways become a sort of successful person in the capitalistic corporate model of doing things. Simon Pegg's character, Gary King, by contrast, has not grown up. He essentially stops developing at age 19. So this group of friends, Gary King, who's the leader, Andy Knightley, his best friend, Stephen Prince, Oliver Oman Chamberlain, and Peter Page, they decide toward the end of the time that they are in school, high school basically, that they're going to do this pub crawl called the Golden Mile, which involves going to 12 pubs along this route through their small town of Newton Haven. They don't make it all the way. Various things happen. Oliver Chamberlain, who as an adult is played by Martin Freeman, he sort of drops off and basically gets left on a bench somewhere. Peter Page, played by Eddie Marsan, I think he falls out of the group at some point as well. Stephen Prince, played by Paddy Considine, does make it as far as Andy and Gary make it, but eventually around the 9th pub, they all sort of lose interest, partially because they're quite drunk by that point, and they end up just sort of wandering off. And that seems to be the high point of Gary King's life, right? He is emotionally stuck in that moment, and it is very much this sort of, I mean, in the US, this would be, right, the American football player, quarterback in high school who never, those were the glory days and things never got better. They never lived any of their dreams, etc., etc. For Gary King, it is that moment of getting drunk, doing what he wants, not having any responsibilities, etc., etc. and this kind of juvenile conception of freedom. And I say juvenile not to denigrate it necessarily. It's a fine conception of freedom in some ways, but it's also a very limiting conception of freedom. And that becomes a really central thematic of the film, because Gary gets all of these now adult former friends, largely. Andy has largely cut him off because, as we find out later in the film, Gary had probably pretended to have OD'd, and Andy drove drunk, wrecked a car, and almost was killed in that car wreck. Gary ran off and abandoned him when that happened. So Andy has largely cut Gary off, out of his life. The others, Stephen, Oliver, and Peter, they haven't necessarily cut him off, but they're not in contact with him. Like, he is not. They're all now professionals. Stephen is an architect. Oliver is a real estate agent. Peter is a used car, or is a car salesman who works for his dad. They've all become adults, and Gary has not. Gary has stayed in this almost fossilized world of being 19. He drives the same car that he bought used from Peter in 1989. He still listens to the mixed cassette tape that Stephen made him back in the 90s. He wears the exact same clothes as an adult that he did as a child. They even point out that he's still wearing his Sisters of Mercy shirt, and he responds that he still likes Sisters of Mercy. So it is this very, like, fossilized human being in some ways. He's not entirely an admirable character, but there is also some degree of whimsy to him that does somewhat redeem him. That being said, he is emotionally manipulative and abusive, and he basically tricks the other four into coming back to their hometown of Newton Haven and doing this pub crawl again to try and complete it. This is something that's extremely emotionally loaded for Gary, and something that the rest of them are really not that keen on doing, but there is this sort of strange element to it where, even though they have all moved on and become adults, there's still that element of Gary King has told them to do something, and so they do it. So it is very interesting, right? Because one question that's sort of raised by this is, what does it actually mean to grow up? I mean, on the surface, they're all married. Some of them are divorced. They're dating. They have good, respectable jobs. They wear suits, etc., etc. On the surface of it, they do appear to be grown-ups. They do appear to be adults. And yet, Gary King tells them to go, and they go. They ostensibly don't want to, but they do it. So it's very, very interesting. There is still that sort of childlike, this is my gang and I'm going to stick with them no matter what kind of mentality. And I think that's very, very interesting about the film. So anyway, what actually happens? Gary gets them all back together. They go back to Newton Haven to do this pub crawl, and things are weird in the town. The pubs have become very, very generic. Like, exactly the same set is used for, I think, the first three pubs. There's only one type of beer that seems to be served. The bartender is unable to describe it in any way, in the way that you would normally expect a bartender to be able to describe something. Something like a beer. And people who know them don't recognize them. Things go on for a little while, and then Gary gets into a fight with this kid in a bathroom. And the kid is what they believe to be a robot. He is superhumanly strong and resilient. Gary pulls his head off at one point, and all this sort of blue goop oozes out. He then gets up headless and continues fighting. His friends come in. They are all robots as well. And this actually becomes a big plot point, is that they aren't actually robots. And the people in the town take offense to being called robots because the word robot, and I knew this etymology before, largely from Rossum's Universal Robots by, his name is escaping me at the moment. I'm going to look it up very quickly, even though it's not crucial to what I'm doing. Karl Čapek, sorry. That was really going to bother me because it's such a great play, and I actually do love it quite a bit. Anyway, so I knew this etymology from Čapek's play, but robot comes from the Czech word robotnik, which means a slave. Over time, we come to find out that these are not, in fact, slaves. They're not, in fact, robots. They are replacements. So basically this alien conglomeration of a wide range of planets has decided that Earth needs to be civilized. And so what they do is they sort of seed strategic places on Earth with replacement humans who will, it's sort of an invasion of the body snatchers thing. But the idea is basically to send out their ideology from these penetration points and prepare humanity to join this intergalactic network, is what it's called, of planets that all sort of function under this same ideology of peace, prosperity, progress, etc. Not bad things necessarily. This is not a, it's not a hostile takeover necessarily. It's not a, they're not evil. They don't want bad things for humanity. They actually want good things for humanity. But it is an external source of interference in human affairs. And Gary, Andy, and Stephen, who by the end are the only three of the five who have not been replaced, along with Oliver's sister Sam, who is Stephen's love interest, who's in and out of the film. Basically, they establish to the network that humanity doesn't want them. Humanity is too unruly. We're too violent. We love freedom too much. We love self-determination too much. They're simply not going to be able to bring us into the network in the way that they want to do. And I think this is a really interesting point, because I don't know that it's true, right? I mean, yes, there's a certain degree to which we as human beings want to be free, want to get drunk, want to have a good time, want to do the things we want to do, etc., etc. The philosophy of Gary King. But we as human beings are also remarkably used to being controlled. I mean, this film came out in 2013. It's a British film. The UK is a capitalist country. Under capitalism, we're told what to do all the time. Our freedom is continually constrained, right? I mean, your boss tells you when you have to come to work, when you're allowed to leave, how long your breaks can be, how much you get paid. The government tells you how much you owe in taxes, what you can do in terms of things like buying a house, in terms of things like how fast you can drive. There's all sorts of regulations on our lives that we all generally obey without question. The UK is an incredibly surveilled society, right? It's a society with a remarkably high number of CCTV cameras. Those are there to control the population, to limit the freedom of the population. And there are certainly people who don't like that. There are certainly people who are opposed to it, but the vast majority of the population accepts it. That is the way that their society works. That is normal for them. And so I'm not necessarily convinced that, and sure, there are anarchic people, anarchic groups, etc., but I'm not necessarily convinced that the network could not be successful in their goal. Right? I mean, we accept constrictions on our freedom all the time, and we accept those things as normal, even as good in many cases. So it's an interesting idea, an interesting argument. I don't know that I buy it. I wish it were more true on some level, right? I wish we were less pliable as a species and less willing to accept things like capitalism, things like autocracy, things like imperialism, all of these negative aspects of the world that we live in. But we do. We accept them all the time. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is the end, and I've already sort of given you some spoilers if you were planning to watch it and didn't want it spoiled, sorry. But at the end, after Gary, Andy, and Steven convince the network to withdraw, it's basically a sort of nuclear meltdown that ends up sending out a kind of pulse throughout the world that destroys all technology and destroys basically modern life. And so you go back to a sort of farming situation, very primitive, basic, sort of living in huts constructed out of rubble type deal. But what's interesting is the network left under the premise of humanity will be left to its own devices. It then essentially destroyed our civilization. If its concern, the stated concern, was that we were the most primitive civilization in the galaxy, if you then destroy us, you have exacerbated that problem. So I think that's a very interesting endpoint. And I don't know what to make of that entirely. So this is a bit of supplemental commentary on The World's End, because I was thinking about it a bit more after I finished making the original video. I was thinking about the ending, right? This idea of the network as a group of planets, civilizations that have come together to live by a shared set of rules, norms, values, ideals, etc., and Earth being sort of the resistors to that. What I should have thought of, because I think this is actually a fairly obvious one, is that this is a Brexit commentary, right? The film comes out in 2013. The Brexit vote is right around the corner. The network is the European Union. And Britain is Gary and Andy and Stephen. The guys who say, no, we want to be left on our own to do what we want and get drunk if we want to and do whatever kind of stupid shit we want to do. What I think is interesting about that is the ambivalence of it. Because on the one hand, I mean, it is a Leave allegory. It is a Brexit allegory in which Gary, Andy, and Stephen have voted Leave. And on the one hand, it destroys human civilization, essentially, right? We are plunged back into what Andy characterizes as the Dark Ages. Technology is destroyed, the quality of life is destroyed, and becomes a sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland. On the other hand, there seems to be some degree of like freedom and simplicity in that apocalyptic destruction. So I don't know if the film has a positive or negative take on the likely consequences of Brexit, or even if that's a question the film is prepared to answer. Wright and Pegg, who helped rewrite this script, I believe, they may not have a distinct political position on the issue at all. But especially reading it in the context of Brexit, it's a very interesting ending.